Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around with us through the end of day 2 of the Path Forward Forum. I popped in and out of rooms and I was just so enthralled with all of the different conversations going on, and I can't wait to hear what everyone has to say from each of their groups. I want to thank all of our facilitators and moderators who just did a fantastic job. Feel free to give them a shout out in chat if you would like. Really appreciate all of their hard work and their help with this. I'm going to go ahead and let you all know about when we're starting tomorrow before we get into this conversation, because I'm afraid we'll forget once we really get into it. So tomorrow morning, our sessions will begin at 9 a.m. You'll just go to the same website where you've been going, click on the link there. Tomorrow we are going to have Dr. Sia Verschelden, who I think you all are just going to love. She's going to be talking about bandwidth recovery, which I think is so crucial for our students right now and actually for ourselves. And then Dr. Aaron Thompson will send us on our way as he casts the vision for post-secondary education in the post-pandemic environment. So now we're going to hear from all of the groups, and I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order based on the group name. So Jessica, we're going to start with you to hear what you all talked about in your racial equity session.
Okay, so we had a somewhat small group, but still amazing conversation. The two main themes that we came up with were bias as our first theme. And some of the key takeaways our group discussed was the fact that there are silos throughout the higher education process. Higher education is slow to change in general regarding equity, but we need to highlight the fact that students can really be the catalyst for change just due to their tuition dollars, and we need them to keep the institution afloat. And then another big thing with bias was the notion of cultural mistrust. And that's basically the tendency for underrepresented minority students and marginalized students to be inherently mistrustful of faculty and staff from certain backgrounds, and understanding that that is not personal to those faculty or staff members, but it's more so functional for their survival and how they navigate through the systematic structure of higher ed. And then our second main theme was difficult conversations. And so with that, we had a couple questions. So how do we get others involved in those conversations? How do we offer the opportunity for dialogue? A couple strategies that were mentioned were to begin the focus on the macro version of that topic versus the micro. So for example, privilege as a macro topic versus white privilege as a micro topic. And then always having grace and love being shown when discussing those issues, looking beyond state and national requirements to offer a layer that includes a different viewpoint when it comes to difficult conversations. A couple questions or answers in regard to greatest fears about having difficult conversations where we will not have an answer that goes far enough, that's widespread enough. The importance of not just checking a box and it being perceived that the institution or the faculty staff members are just checking a box and not sincere, or saying the wrong thing, or saying something that will be perceived as racist or insensitive, even though that's not the intention, because we make mistakes when we're trying to learn something or understand something. And just having a fear of how we will be perceived without meaning to be that way. And then I'd say the last thing was mandatory versus optional professional development for faculty and staff, and how to approach those conversations with getting people more involved in DEI efforts that are sort of on the fringes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessica.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear from the mental health group, and their moderator is Beth.
Hello, everyone. So in our session, we had a mix of persons who were affiliated with post-secondary institutions and then those that were affiliated with our middle and high school institutions. So in our breakout sessions, we actually divided those by institutional affiliation to have some conversations that were more specific. So in the post-secondary group, their key areas, topics that were identified were around, let's see, I'm looking through my notes here. Sometimes there's a lack of knowledge about mental health resources that are available and how they can bridge that divide by one idea was to develop kind of a resource guide for faculty to use, but then there's the issue of keeping that current and up to date. But some of their planning goals were to coordinate with the first year experience office, better connections to community services outside of their university, right? Diversity of counseling staff on campuses. So while it's one thing to have an adequate number to meet the needs, you also need to have diversity in that group of counselors providing those services so that students can identify and be more willing to seek those services. So their goal of increased resource literacy, sharing those resources with staff and keeping it as current as possible. In the middle and high school group, we were kind of a unique group in that all of us that were in that group conversation are external resources in the form of Gear Up or Talent Search. So some of the obstacles that we encounter are issues around, we can see what our student needs are, but because we're not administrators within those districts, and we can't make decisions that help, bridge the gaps that we're seeing, right? So sometimes we have those restrictions. All of us are seeing the issue of tech fatigue with our students at all levels, as we're all aware of and feeling some of ourselves, right? So one of the things that we talked about in that group with Miriam facilitating that conversation was, meeting students where they're at on what that platform is. Right now, it happens to be TikTok. But figuring out how to bridge that, we're working toward that. Another thing that we spoke about when we came back in our large group was the fact that while we're all trying to maintain positivity, and that we know that the students in our lives mimic the emotions of the adults, especially in this pandemic, it's important to allow them space to get the negative out. Everything can't always be a positive conversation. And to remember that that's okay, to allow them to have that space to get their negative feelings out about what's going on, because it's only then that you can move forward with solutions, right? Some of our issues also too are lack of training about what is the responsibility of certain personnel within school districts or even at the post-secondary level. And it was mentioned several times, is the mental health first aid, and that CPE is offering funding for universities to partake in that. And it's an 8-hour training session. So I encourage all of you to reach out for that resource also. That's about, we did a lot of talking. It is mental health, right? So it was an example of everyone allowing space to make their statements and be heard. But I think the worksheets that Miriam and Dr. Barch provided will allow us all to move forward also with the conversations that we need to have.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. Next in line, we have Natalie, who was with the hybrid learning group.
Hi, good afternoon. Like the other moderators, I feel like there was so much wonderful information shared during our session, and that those participants that came were really passionate about this topic. I think that Alicia and Jennifer did a wonderful job with facilitating this. They began the conversation with just asking, what does hybrid learning mean to you? And that opened up the door for us realizing that hybrid means many things to many different people. It doesn't even mean the same thing to all K-12 educators versus all higher ed educators. So right there, we're seeing an issue and needing to kind of level the playing field. What do we mean when we say hybrid? Do we need to use different terms to mean different things? And that spread into our conversation and our mentee to see what our topics would be. Engagement was by far the greatest issue that everyone felt they were facing, both K-12 and higher education. So we took that as our primary category and broke out into rooms for higher ed and K-12, again, to facilitate those conversations so that we could have our little pockets of conversation before we came back to the bigger group. We also spoke a little bit about help and inspiration, both from the student perspective and the facilitator perspective, that, that's needed all around. So for our K-12 group with help and inspiration, by far, there is a need for a P16 collaboration, not just a K-12 world and then higher ed's doing their own thing. We need to bring it together. There needs to be more collaboration. There needs to be more conversation. I've heard this conversation many times about, well, college blames the high school educators, who blames the middle school educators, who blames the elementary educators. Like, we need to stop the blame and we need to work more towards collaboration, really focusing on easing that transition from high school into college for our students, making it seamless. And that's everything from, if our high school students are accustomed to using Google Docs in the Google world, and they're stepping into a higher education environment that focuses on Word, then we need to make sure that we are empowering those students to be able to make those transitions in those hybrid environments to do that. For help and inspiration in our higher education group, we heard a lot of the same things. And I loved that we had participants say, we need to acknowledge that there is change fatigue happening, and it's for everyone. And I loved here that it says people want routine without being told that flexibility is what they have to do. And I thought that that was powerful, acknowledging that students are feeling it, faculty is feeling it, administrators are feeling it. I also love the quote that we need to find the fun. We need to find it for ourselves. We need to find it for our students in this hybrid world. And most powerfully is instructors need adequate and appropriate equipment to facilitate hybrid learning. We can't expect them to use all these tools and technology if we haven't given them the appropriate tools and we haven't trained them on how to use the appropriate tools. We're asking them to do things at home, work from home, and then work from an office. We need to make sure that that equipment is equitable at every location, that our teachers and instructors are doing that. So device preparation and training is key to really help and inspire what needs to happen in the hybrid world. And then finally, for engagement, we had a big focus on higher education engagement. We didn't have as many K-12 participants in that conversation. I really loved this comment from our participants that we need to abandon the archaic educational practices that we've had before and really need to embrace ongoing learning and learning orientations alongside the students. We can't expect students to adapt and step into this hybrid world and know what to do if we don't have faculty and instructors that are willing to do the same, to be vulnerable, to do that alongside with them. And I thought that was very powerful. Adjusting to this new normal, that's going to take time. We need to encourage students to give themselves some grace, to give ourselves some grace as instructors and administrators, and remembering that for a lot of our students, they haven't experienced what traditional college is. This hybrid world is what they've known. So as we keep some of those components and move into others, we need to give ourselves grace. And then one other topic that seemed to kind of stick out, and Jennifer, one of our facilitators, was wonderful to mention, there is worry that we are going to have a loss of the technology gains that we made while being at home during this pandemic. And what Jennifer has noticed is that's not true. For our students, particularly in K-12, that are stepping back into the classroom, they're taking those technology gains with them. The instructors are incorporating that into their in-person learning. So that's wonderful that we're not seeing a backtrack of that we're seeing it come together in this world. And finally, that with this grace and needing for students and ourselves, the world is still changing. Some institutions are opening up and going back to a traditional learning model. Others are embracing hybrid. Others are saying, well, we're going to do some asynchronous, some in person. We still have a lot of change. It's still difficult for us to come together and say, what do we need to do across the board? Because everything is so different for our different institutions. So that grace and understanding for ourselves and our students is key.
Amazing findings. I I want people to know too that this is not just a conversation to have the conversation. These are conversations that will help impact and affect change as we move forward, as we look at these findings and continue these discussions. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. Now we're going to move on to Carrie, who was with the Affordability group.
Well, hello. So I'm afraid my group, not surprising, kind of went off the beaten path. And while our, y'all are already laughing like, we know, Carrie. While the worksheet did provide a guideline, really our breakout rooms went in a bunch of different directions, which was wonderful to see, because we tend to think of like affordability and just think of FAFSA. But our breakout rooms covered FAFSA completion, the social emotional challenges around affordability, cultural viewpoints around affordability, and then adult learners. So instead of kind of what our goals were, I'm just going to tell you about the big key takeaways that each conversation had. With FAFSA, it was how do we help students complete the FAFSA? How do we grow awareness? And how do we make all participants within the FAFSA comfortable talking about it, such as college recruiters, financial aid counselors, teachers, various personnel within the college? How do we create a comfortability around the FAFSA form? Granted, we did show Dr. Thompson's TikTok video, and we agree that that was the perfect way to start the comfortability. So really, for the FAFSA breakout group, it was more, how do we get all students to fill that out and feel comfortable filling it out? With the social emotional challenges, majority of that conversation revolved around the Senate Bill 128, that 5th year option that's coming up. And how is that going to impact colleges, the grants that they give out? How is it going to impact students who stay versus those who don't? How do we figure out what students should be staying, such as, are only high performing students staying? How do we encourage the low performing students to stay and take a part of that 5th year option? And then from the cultural viewpoints, I'm going to directly quote them from when we got back together. They said, we ran the gambit, which was wonderful to see. They talked about the different barriers that led students to not fill out the FAFSA applications, such as, are students being supported in their visions? Are we forcing a narrative onto students and not realizing what's best for them? Are we not listening to them? So how do we really hone down and listen to the student needs and what that cultural perspective is and how that impacts those student needs? And then from the adult learners, they really talked about how the focus is on more traditional age students. How do we create areas of growth and development for those adult learners? How do we know what adult learners are engaging in? Are they getting the credentials they need? Are they realizing that affordability options are out there for them? Could that be why there aren't more adult learners? How do you engage with those adult learners? So again, while we didn't necessarily go through the whole worksheet to get to actions and success and progress, I can guarantee you there were some wonderful conversations going on in our group.
And I love that these conversations have gone on, because that leads to more conversations and that leads to action and change. So great. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off because I see that my name's appearing a lot. We're having some Zoom issues with me. So don't think
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap up our discussion with the admissions group and Jennifer.
Oh, and Missy, it won't let me. Oh, no, just kidding. Now it'll let me share my video. I was going to say trickery, April Fools, everyone. But here I am. Sorry. No, but seriously, thank you. We had such an amazing session. So thanks for allowing me to share some highlights from the admissions test optional session. We also had a phenomenal facilitator, University of Louisville admissions director, Jenny Sawyer, who really prompted and spurred our thinking around the latest aspects of test optional policies and admissions. So as it turned out, we had 2 breakout rooms that were tied to the themes of generally kind of the transition to post-secondary, but then also test optional policies and implications. So what I found to be really interesting as the group shared out is the amount of parallel information as well as concerns really shared across these 2 breakout groups. So to begin, we really talked about the clarity of information that we're providing to stakeholders and the super important role that this plays. I know that seems really kind of commonsensical, but it's certainly super important and something that's been elevated, I think, especially during the pandemic. There was also lots of emphasis around this year just not being normal and trying to keep up with all the changes colleges and universities are undergoing. It's difficult, especially with all that's new and that everyone is doing different things. So just in summation, really, it's just been a challenging year to say the very least. We then shifted to talking about the current role and huge impact of placement that could potentially delay students from taking credit-bearing classes, and even just talked a little bit about the fact that some students don't want to take the placement exam and kind of what happens then, the impacts. From there, we shifted the majority of our conversation to focus on the ACT, and collectively, the group really landed on the stance that ACT should not be the sole indicator of success, and then trying to figure out, well, what is it that really matters then? So also talked a little bit about test scores not being as important as they have been in the past, whereby our discussion then pivoted to grit and resilience as greater predictors of success, and also GPA, which might be a better measure. We also then talked a little bit about what students were doing. So if they were taking dual credit classes and scoring well, is there a point really to taking the ACT as they're able to demonstrate success in taking these college level courses? So I think ultimately just trying to figure out what gives us the best picture of whether a student's going to be successful and if they're prepared really is being more important than just passing a particular test. We then kind of pivoted over to how do we reach the students who need extra support, and what are those placement models and other supports, whether it's summer bridge programming or otherwise, that might be needed to be considered. In terms of talking about our goals and objectives, we really kind of put at the forefront that exploring opportunities to evaluate policies and what to do about students who just can't get the score that they need. Again, that there might be more to it than just an ACT score that determines a student's future. So how do we best help our students to get into the placement that they need and deserve? A little bit about data. We talked again about GPA and dual credit, what kind of platforms that institutions might have. We talked about the price restraints around that. We talked about portfolios and maybe even some biases behind portfolios. But we also talked about just needing a methodology that's acceptable to faculty, and how do we consider the complexities of our students' lives. When we got to partnership, I was really encouraged that, and this seems to be a common theme across all of our sessions today, is that we need comprehensive voices at the table. You know, if all these things are impacting students, I think my breakout group in particular was emphatic that students have got to be at the table. And that includes our GED graduates and adult learners as well. We've got to hear and listen to what they want and need. We also talked about just kind of that bridge between high school and college, whether it's faculty or counselors and admission folks, but making sure that we have the most comprehensive voices at the table. We talked about some obstacles. We talked about race. We talked about having enough student data. We talked about getting faculty on board and just really kind of the time and efforts around this. And then kind of to close, I know this has been a lot, sorry. We had such a great group, I'm telling you. We looked at some success measures, and we looked at success in gateway credit-bearing courses and also the graduation rates of our students. So again, super amazing group, inspiring to say the least as they tackled these really tough issues. So thanks for letting me share.
It's wonderful, Jennifer. And so all these things all this little snippets of discussion have left me wanting more. The good news is that technology willing, that the sessions that you weren't able to attend, you will be able to review. We will be posting that on the website. The discussion that we're having now, I'm going to put this link into the chat. It is going to be on the CPE YouTube site. So let me make sure I have that in there. Are there any other comments or questions that anyone had before we wrap up today? Okay, we have the YouTube channel in there. So shortly, if you want to go back and review and hear what some of our wonderful moderators have shared from their groups, you may do so. I want to thank all of you all so much for your participation today. It sounds like each session really had some amazing findings, and I look forward to seeing where these conversations lead. I hope you all have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thank you all so much.